Hello and welcome to Management 6337, Organization Development and Change. This presentation will cover the various change models covered in the textbook, and we'll compare and contrast those models. To start, we are looking at Kurt Lewin's model, three-step model of change, which is the unfreeze, movement, and refreeze model. The concept behind this is you can think of it as unfreezing an ice cube into water, moving that water into a different form, perhaps a different ice cube tray, and then refreezing it. The concept is that we're not trying to change the substance in which that we're working with, rather we're changing the state, moving it to a different form, and then refreezing it to a solid state thereafter as well, so that the change becomes permanent. Moving to the next slide, we're looking at the action research model. One can immediately understand and notice that this is a much more complex model, many more boxes than Kurt Lewin's three-step model. On the left-hand side, we have the entry phase, which is problem identification, the consultant phase, and also the data gathering and preliminary diagnosis. In the middle, in the orange square, we have feedback to the client group or to the key client that we have going within the consulting process. And on the right-hand side, multiple steps of joint diagnosis of the problem, action planning, then creating action, and then again, data gathering once again. And this is why it's called the action research model, is that there are numerous points of data gathering and diagnosis phases. One will also notice the continuous feedback loop on the right-hand side is that once we are completing an action, we're gathering data and feeding that back to the client group and re-diagnosing the problem again and taking further action. Moving to the positive model, one will immediately notice this is less complex than the action research model, and the boxes do cover higher level concepts of themes and envisioning a preferred future and designing and delivering ways to create the future, not necessarily to the specific detail of what the action research model had. However, one will also notice at the bottom of the diagram, there's a blue arrow going from design and deliver ways to create the future back up to inquire into best practices. This is the feedback loop that is very consistent within most of the models. Next, we're looking at the continuous change model. This model itself looks more simplistic than the remaining models that we have already covered, in that we have discovering, designing, tailoring, and assessing. In reality, this is one of the more complex models because of the complexity going between the different phases, and also that the idea is that this is a continuous cycle of constant feedback, constant data gathering, and constant movement between the different phases. So again, just a few words for the continuous change model is that it addresses dynamic change requirements in the sense that while the model itself looks fairly simplistic, it is actually addressing very complex change requirements. It coordinates and prioritizes multiple changes simultaneously, whereas we can think about the action research model, because we are looking at it from such specific area, the action research model in that perspective is working on that same change, that one change over and over and over again. And the continuous change model by nature, because it is more flexible, allows for multiple changes at the same time. Also can be customized and is more fluid in terms of the change initiatives, and builds complex and continuous change capabilities into the organization. Again, sometimes the more simplistic models are deceiving from the perspective that just because we have fewer boxes on the page does not necessarily mean that it is a simpler process. So for a quick comparison between the models, and again, this is at a very high level, so take this for the grain of salt that it is, simply that this is the introductory PowerPoint to comparing the various change models. Similarities, we see that change is preceded by a diagnosis phase or a preparation before we enter into the change action. We also see that we're applying behavioral science knowledge, and we stress the involvement of organizational members across all of those various change models. We must have constituents within the organization in order for us to actually interview, gather information, provide feedback to, and occasionally actually implement the change for us as well. The last is that we recognize the role of the consultant within all of those. The consultant, as we will learn, is both from the perspective that there can be internal consultants as well as external consultants, and numerous parties involved throughout the entire process. Differences. General versus specific activities. Again, the action research model is very, very specific, whereas the continuous change model is less specific. Centrality of the consultant role. Once again, we talked about the action research model to where the consultant was very heavily involved, very well named within the model. Comparatively to the continuous change model, the consultant wasn't not necessarily named. And problem solving versus social constructionism. Similar again, the action research model was trying to solve very specific problems by naming those, versus the positive model, for example, the social constructionism, is simply looking at themes and trying to envision futures for the organization. Our last slide is the general model of planned change. Reading from left to right in the blue box starting, we have entering and contracting, where this is the entry phase into the project, to where the consultants will come in and try to understand what is the problem, what is the client representing as the problem, start asking questions and hopefully asking the deep questions before we're getting to a contracting phase so that the parties are lined up on activities and things going forward. Diagnosing, the pink box, is we're trying to go through and understand more about the organization. The next box to the right, which is planning and implementing change. This is the idea that once we've completed the diagnosing phase, we're planning on what we're going to be doing, and then we're actually implementing change in this phase as well. And on the far right-hand side, the evaluating and reinforcing change, is that we always are collecting data. We're always evaluating what we're doing. And as we can see at the very bottom, there are feedback loops going back into each of the previous phases as well. Feedback is a highly critical component over all of the change models, something that cannot be ignored.